Section H, frustrated farmers. So things were going really well in the 20s for a lot of people. The exception to that rule is the farmers. Okay, because during World War I, the farmers were living it up. A lot of countries in Europe were off fighting wars, so couldn't really produce enough crops to sustain themselves. So America had really become the breadbasket of at least the Allied forces during World War I. So farmers started to expand during World War I. They bought more fields. They also invested or took out loans to buy these newfangled things like gasoline-powered engines or gasoline-engined tractors, which really increased the yield they were able to produce. So during World War I, really producing a lot. Let's just say that. However, after the war ended, and countries over in Europe started to pick up the pieces, started to farm themselves again, that's when we really see the farmers hit some obstacles in America. Because one, they're overproducing. I shouldn't say overproducing, but they're producing a surplus, right? The worldwide demand is going down because countries over in Europe are supplying crops now as well. So the prices of crops are going down, while at the same time, they still have to pay back all of the loans they had taken out while they're expanding during World War I. So the loan for that fancy new tractor, the loan for those, new hundreds of acres of land they'd farmed during World War I, those came due. So we see farmers really just stuck in this almost unsurmountable amount of debt. We'll see during the 1920s about a quarter of all farms will go bankrupt, or about 1 in 4 farms will have to be sold off to pay debt or back taxes. And really, we see, legislation trying to help them a little bit. We see the Capper-Volstead Act, which exempted farm marketing cooperatives from antitrust laws, so making sure that when farmers work together, that wouldn't be hindered by any antitrust laws. And then we have the McNary-Haugen bill, set up kind of that the federal government would buy the surplus crops. So all of that surplus they're producing, the federal government would buy those crops and then sell those crops off somewhere overseas. Now this is a bill that never actually saw the light of day, but this is the bill the farmers were really kind of rooting for. And we'll see, Calvin Coolidge, it passes through Congress twice, but Calvin Coolidge will veto it twice because Calvin Coolidge and a lot of Republican presidents during this time think the government should be kept out of the economic system. The government should be kept out of the social system. So this is Calvin Coolidge is seeing this McNary-Haugen bill as really kind of government interference where there ought not be any interference. So he vetoes it. Okay. So we get the food prices remain low, and the agitation, you can say, of the farmers remains high. So this becomes a very big issue in the upcoming 1924 election. All right, Section I, a 3-way race for the White House in 1924. Talking about the election in 1924. So the Republicans keep Calvin Coolidge as their candidate. Calvin Coolidge, was president during a very prosperous time. So the idea is people like him, things are going well in America, we'll just keep Calvin Coolidge for the Republicans. Okay. The Democrats, on the other hand, they're really kind of a split party. And they're not just split in 2 big sections, but there's a lot of different divisions within the Democratic Party. You have, let me see here. You have people who are for prohibition. You have people who are against prohibition. You have people who are used to living in cities. You also have farmers. You kind of have new immigrants, and you also kind of have the old stock Americans. So it was really hard for the Democrats to kind of agree on any candidate because there were so many different fractions kind of fighting for their own personal candidate. So after 102 different votes or 102 different ballots, the Democrats finally agreed to nominate John W. Davis. Okay, Davis was a very wealthy corporate lawyer. He had connections with J.P. Morgan and Company. And really, he was a very conservative candidate. Okay, he was much like Calvin Coolidge. So because the Democrats nominate also a political conservative, just like the Republicans, it really clears the path during the 24 election for a liberal candidate to step up in perhaps a third party, and that's exactly what we'll see. So we see the Republicans nominating Coolidge. We see the Democrats coming up with another conservative candidate in John W. Davis. And then we see kind of the Progressive Party forming slightly again, kind of rising from the ashes, and they nominate Senator Robert Fighting Bob LaFollette. Okay, he's from Wisconsin. We've mentioned him before. He's definitely a progressive candidate. So Fighting Bob LaFollette is kind of being put forth as this liberal progressive candidate. And he really gains support from those that are left of the progressives in America. He gets support by the major labor union, the AFL. He also gets support from socialists. And probably the most important thing is he gets support from farmers. Okay, farmers are hurting, and they look to Lafayette as really the only candidate that would work to help them out. So the farmers are going to be voting for the Progressive Party, Senator Lafayette. Okay, So some of their the platform of the Progressive Party in the 24 election, they want the government control of railroads. They want to help farmers out. They all hated monopolies. And they wanted to pass an amendment that would limit the power of the Supreme Court. So very, progressive ideas. Okay. However, when all is said and done, when all of the ballots were counted in 1924, Coolidge definitely won the day. Coolidge got 382 votes. Davis came in second with 136, and then Lafayette got 13, and all of those 13 votes came from his home state of Wisconsin. So really the idea was times are going good. Why would we pick a liberal candidate? Why would we pick a progressive candidate when we could just keep Coolidge and, keep riding this economic wave of expansion? Section J, foreign policy floundering. Okay, so Coolidge continued on that strong Republican tradition of isolationism during his term in office. But the only really notable exception to that was our involvement in the Caribbean and Latin American countries. For example, we definitely had troops in Haiti, we had troops in Nicaragua. Also, the U.S. government stepped in to kind of settle some disputes between the Mexican government and some oil interests we had in Mexico. But really, above and beyond anything else, our foreign policy involvement after World War I really had to deal with international debts. Okay. The idea here is that the United States had loaned billions and billions of dollars to the Allied forces, most notably France and Britain, during World War I, something to the tune of $16 billion. So now that World War I's over, the United States starts, calling in those loans, wanting to be repaid. But the deal was that France and Britain thought it was unjust that America would call in these loans, because they figured, they had a number of good reasons. They wanted the United States more or less to just brush aside those costs or those loans as a cost of war. For example, they said, hey, you know what? Our young men, fought and died, kind of paid for the war in their blood. We shouldn't have to pay back money to the United States because our part of the war effort was so much greater anyway, paying for the war in our blood. Okay, another reason they had was that, hey, you know what? If you want us to pay back these loans, why don't you lower the tariff a little bit? Your tariff is so high right now that you're more or less not trading with us. And if you're not going to trade with us, how are we supposed to make the money to pay you back with? Okay. And also they had the kind of justification that all of the money that they had taken from loans from the United States, they had in turn poured back into the United States economy during the war. Remember, they had a lot, making arms, making supplies for war. All of that business really helped America boom during World War I. So they said, you know what, all the money you gave to us, we more or less threw back at you. So they thought they shouldn't have to pay back these loans. Calvin Coolidge said, no, you're paying back the loans. Okay. So let's go to section K. Unraveling the debt knot. Okay. So here's the deal. Because we demanded that France and Britain pay back the loans we had given to them, now France and Britain started to look to Germany to get some money from Germany. A part of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, for countries other than the United States apparently, a part of that had a war guilt clause that more or less blamed Germany for starting the war. And because the Treaty of Versailles blamed Germany for starting the war, attached to that was about $32 billion in war reparations, kind of blaming Germany for the war, so Germany is going to pay us money for starting it. So $32 billion Germany was supposed to pay back to the Allied nations. So here's the deal, okay? The United States is kind of breathing down the necks of France and of Britain to pay back their loans. So France and Britain in the turn are kind of breathing down the necks of Germany to pay them the money owed through these kind of war reparations. Okay, so this is what happens. Okay, Germany's economic system collapses. It just goes kapoof because Germany starts to print and 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 print all of this currency, all of this paper cash. So the value of a German mark, which is kind of like their dollar, just plummeted. I'll give you some examples here. Okay, so in 1923, which was the worst year for this, hyperinflation, one American dollar, just one American dollar, was worth 4,210,500,000,000 marks. Or another way to put that, if you wanted to buy a loaf of bread in Germany, you had to pay 480 million marks. So more or less their paper currency was worthless. And not only did that totally mess with Germany's economic system, but it messed with kind of the global financial system. Because if they're going to be paying money back in these almost valueless marks, it wasn't really going to work well with this loan system. So finally, America did get involved. What we set up was something called the Dawes Plan of 1924, named after Charles Dawes, who I believe was the vice president at the time. So the plan was that, one, they were going to reschedule Germany's reparation payments, so kind of spreading those payments out a little further, and also was going to clear the way for further American private loans to Germany. So now we kind of have this kind of funny little wheel of debt going on. I'm going to try to explain this to you. So, Germany owed war reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain owed money to the United States. And now a part of the Dawes Plan is the United States is loaning money to Germany. So in effect, it's just kind of a circle of debt. So say, the United States loans Germany $5. Germany pays that $5 back to France and Britain, and France and Britain gives that $5 back to the United States. So really in the scheme of things, it's just kind of the circular cycle of debt, and it really is not helping anyone out. Okay. Only thing it really did is the fact that it left some really hard feelings. One, France and Britain had some hard feelings against the United States because they were forcing them to pay back this debt. And two, Germany is feeling really pressured, really kind of almost panicky about the fact that they have to pay all this reparation money back. And so when we see the stock market crash in 1929 and the United States enter into depression, as does Europe, we really see any repayment of the loans more or less stop anyway. So 1929, no one's really paying back any loans, except for Finland. Finland stays on track and pays off all their loans by 1976. Good job, Finland. You are the exception to the rule. Okay, so let's go to the next section. Section L, the triumph of Herbert Hoover in 1928. Okay, so we're talking about the election of 1928. So Calvin Coolidge could have run for an additional term, but he chooses not to. And he might have had a good chance of winning because America was still prosperous in 28. Remember, it's not till 29 that things get a little iffy. So in 28, Calvin Coolidge decides, I don't want to be president anymore. I'm not going to run during 28's election. So really, the Republicans nominate Herbert Hoover, who had been Coolidge's Secretary of Commerce. A lot of people just knew Hoover's name. He was kind of the shoo-in for the candidate of the Republicans in the 28 elections. He was very much admired by the masses. All of the work he did during World War I with the Food Administration, they just admired the guy. Okay, and the Democratic Party still in 28 is divided between these fractions who are for prohibition, against prohibition, who are new immigrants versus people who are old Americans. That's probably not the right word, but you know what I'm saying, like old stock Americans, city folks versus farm folks. So this division is still going on in 28. But the Democrats nominate Alfred E. Smith, who was the 4-time governor of New York. And Smith was, he was a New Yorker, and he had some kind of political handicaps kind of going along with him. One, he was kind of too abrasive, too urban for a lot of the Midwesterners really to take a hold of. He was a little bit just too abrasive. Also, he was Catholic, so a lot of the Protestants, didn't like that so much. And then also he was anti-prohibition, so you could say he was a wet candidate. So all of these three things were kind of working against him. There were some whisperings, a vote for Al Smith is the vote for the Pope. Romanism, and ruin is what you'll get if you vote for Al Smith, that sort of thing. So definitely had some handicaps. And on the flip side, we look at Herbert Hoover. And Hoover's going to become president, so we're going to just kind of introduce him a little bit here. So Herbert Hoover was definitely American success story. He was from Iowa. Pause for applaud. Yay, Iowa. Okay, so he's from Iowa, but he was really poor and actually had been orphaned as a child. But he was very independent, very much believed in rugged individualism, being self-reliant, pulling yourself up from your bootstraps, because that's what he did in his life. He worked his way through Stanford, so he got into Stanford, got himself an education, became a successful mining engineer, then a successful businessman. Of course, he had traveled abroad extensively. He had been in China. He had worked with folks in Belgium. He had never actually run for office before. It's not like he was a congressman or a governor, but he had been involved in politics on the federal level. Once again, remember during World War I, head of the Food Administration during the war. So yeah, and really his strength was in the fact that he had a lot of kind of these small town values, but experience in the modern corporation, modern corporate America. So kind of the juxtaposition of those two were unique. He had a lot of integrity. He was very efficient. He inspired loyalty in his associates. They would call him the chief. Just a really good leader. He was a self-made millionaire. Pretty awesome. All right. Okay, so when it came down to it, Hoover won in a landslide. We'll see Hoover gets 444 electoral votes to only 87 to Al Smith. And we'll actually see this is the first time Hoover, of course, a Republican candidate, all the presidents during the 20s are Republican, he actually gains 5 states that were in the former Confederacy and all of the border states. And the reason he gains these votes in the South that would traditionally go to the Democratic nominee is once again because of Al Smith's character. He was Catholic. He was just hard to swallow, a hard pill for the South to swallow. So a lot of southern states will actually vote for the Republican Hoover, and we'll see Hoover then just really in a landslide win the 28 election. Okay, section M, President Hoover's first moves. Okay, so at first, this is March of 28. Anyway, so when he first becomes president, times were still good. That bull market was continuing to rise. But like we mentioned before, it's really the folks that are hurting the most are those poor farmers who are in over their head in debt. So they start to pass some things to help out the farmers. There's an Agricultural Marketing Act that creates the Federal Farm Board. And the Federal Farm Board, their intention is they loan money to farmers to help them create and maintain kind of farmer co-ops. During Hoover's campaign, he had promised as part of his campaign that if he was elected, that he would call Congress into a special session to help lower the tariff and to help pass some bills that would really help the farmers who are in desperate need of assistance. So Hoover calls a special session in Congress, and his idea is he wants to see the tariff lowered. Remember, tariffs are always hard on farmers because it makes products that farmers buy very expensive. So to help the farmers out, they want to lower the tariff. So what happens? They start the tariff off in the House, and there's some moderate reductions in the tariff when it goes through the House. But now it's going through the Senate, and the Senate is notorious for having a lot of people lobbying for special interests. So once this tariff bill makes it through the Senate, there is about 1,000 amendments or changes made to it. So in effect, when this tariff is passed, by the way, this is called the Hawley-Smoot tariff. It's a fun name, Hawley-Smoot. Anyway, Hawley-Smoot tariff, by the time it actually gets through the Senate, the tariff rate had gone from about, 38% to 60%. 60% tariff. That's insane. That is so high. And really, when we're passing this tariff, it's a slap in the face to a lot of foreign nations because 60% tariff is insurmountable. It's more or less cutting off all trade with foreign countries because there's no way that foreign countries can compete when they have to have a 60% tariff or 60% tax on those goods coming into America. And really we see this Hawley-Smoot tariff is passed in 1930, so this is right after we have the Great Crash of 29, which we'll still talk about. So really what this does is it completely builds these walls of around the United States economics, or around the United States economically. And we'll see the European countries then build tariff walls around themselves as well. And this really feeds into or builds the foundation on which people like Adolf Hitler then can rise. More about him later. Yeah, so really it deepens the worldwide depression. This 60% tariff, it's not a good thing economically. Okay, section N. The Great Crash ends, the golden 20s. Okay, so Hoover takes his oath of office in March 4th of 1929. And, except for those farmers, things are still going good. We have those new industries like the car, like the radio, like Hollywood, and those are just helping to even boost our economy, help expand it further and further. Okay, Hoover had created the Federal Reserve Board to help kind of regulate a little bit the stock market, but really it didn't do a lot of good. So the stock market was going about almost unregulated, and it was about time that the speculation bubble was going to burst. And there were some economists who were warning Americans that this, bull market was not going to last forever, that this bubble of speculation, buying stock on margin was going to burst eventually. And the bubble bursts October of 1929. The stock market comes a crashing down. And really the trigger that starts this stock market crash was actually in Britain. Because in Britain, they started to in Britain they started to raise the rate of loans. So the interest rate on loans was going fairly high in Britain. So that caused a lot of British people to sell their stocks because they figured, okay, I'm going to sell my stocks, pay back that loan because cost-benefit analysis here, the loan interest rate is too high. I'm not going to make any money. So I'm just going to sell my stock, pay off the loan, and kind of get out of the stock market. Well, when the British folks or British investors started to pull their stocks out of the stock market, it kind of created a panic. So people started to sell their stock, and then the price of stock would lower. So people just started to sell and sell and sell their stock, hoping to sell it before the stock price fell any lower. So really creating this kind of rippled effect. People were just panicking, trying to sell stock. So we see on Black Tuesday, which is October 29th of 1929, over 16 million shares of stock were sold on the market. So in place of this booming economy, we start to see an economy that is doomed. Replace the boom with the doom. So by the end of 1929, the next 2 months, we see that Americans lose about $40 billion in paper value or in the stock market. And of course, the depression just sets in the United States, and that depression is, of course, also felt in or abroad or in Europe as well. By 1930, 4 million folks were unemployed. That number tripled in the next 2 years. So in 1932, we see 12 million unemployed workers. And even those who don't lose their job, a lot of those have their wages cut drastically. So things were not looking good. In the first 3 years, we see about 5,000 banks collapse. And remember, at this time, if a bank collapses, if your bank closes, you lose your life savings. So tens of thousands of folks lost their life savings through the closing of these banks. And, it just wasn't a good thing. Also, banks were closing. As banks were panicking, they're calling in loans. So people are losing their farms, people are losing their homes. And we see the size of families shrink. People stop having bigger families, and we see the lines of the soup kitchen increasing. So panic definitely setting in. This Black Tuesday crash, October 29th, 1929, right? That's an easy date to remember, the 29th of October in 1929. We really see now the Great Depression is going to set in. So that we'll look at the Great Depression, and that's more or less going to be the rest of this chapter.